With Dinesh D'Souza. This is the third conversation with him. There is so much. His new book is called The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. An absolutely shocking thesis, all the more shocking because, unfortunately, it's true. Dinesh, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be on the show.
It's so important to educate. That's what I try to do on the show, to help people understand these things, and then they can make their own, draw their own conclusions. But what you're saying in here, because of the climate of political correctness in our culture today, it's hard to talk about these things. People, other than you, really, tend not to take this on. You are willing to take it on. Why are you willing to take on these incendiary issues, these issues that make everybody upset? Why are you willing to go there?
Because if we ignore these issues, we become vulnerable to either a kind of fog of misinformation or what I call big lies. In other words, we believe things that aren't true. I mean, what's always fascinating me, Eric, is how do you meet educated people who know things that aren't true? How does that come to be? How does one pull off a big lie? Now, Hitler, by the way, the term the big lie is Hitler's term. And Hitler's point is that if you have a small lie, you can check it out. People can catch it. So, the Benghazi business was due to a video. That's a small lie. If you want your doctor, you can keep your doctor. That's a small lie. But Hitler's point is a big lie is a lie so huge, you can't get your head around it. And so to me, the big lie becomes a challenge. I say to myself, not only I want to prove it's a lie, I want to sort of give the genealogy of the lie, how it came to be, how people came to believe it, why the lie appeared true enough for people to affirm it. But I do this with a concreteness of detail that I think makes it impossible to ignore. It'd be one thing if I just made proclamations unsupported, but I'll take an individual, in fact, sometimes an individual who's seen as a champion of openness and freedom. Take George Soros. George Soros says that he's an apostle of the open society. The open society. He says he's motivated by fighting totalitarianism, and you may say collectivism. Now, once I start digging into the life of George Soros, I realize that George Soros grew up in Hungary, which was, at the time, Nazi-occupied Hungary. I find an interview that George Soros did several years ago on CBS with Steve Kroft, 60 Minutes, in which Steve Kroft asked him, is it not a fact that when you were in your teens, you were actually going around with another guy confiscating the property of Jews and turning them over to the Nazi-friendly regime?
Wait a minute. I've never heard this. You keep saying these things, and the reason I'm shocked is because I know you don't just say things. I've never heard this.
Okay, I'm going to read you.
Steve Kroft said this on 60 Minutes, but it's never been repeated other than now.
If you go on Google, you can't find it. It's been scrubbed off the internet, but I have the transcript and I have the show. So I'm just going to read a little bit. Kroft, you're a Hungarian Jew. Soros, Kroft to escape the Holocaust. Soros, Kroft by posing as a Christian. Soros, right. Kroft, and you watch lots of people get shipped off to death camps. Soros, right. And then we go down a little bit further. Kroft, my understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore you were his adopted godson. Soros, yes. Kroft went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews. Soros, yes, that's right, yes. And then Kroft goes, basically, how could you do it? Here's the key point. Soros. So Kroft says, was that difficult? Soros, no, not at all. Kroft goes, no feeling of guilt? Soros, no. Kroft, for example, I'm Jewish and here I am watching these people go. I could easily be there. I should be there. None of that. And basically, Soros comes back with a very remarkable statement. Soros basically says, listen, those bad things were happening anyway. I didn't cause them to happen. I merely took advantage of them. I was merely, in a sense, exploiting the situation for my own benefit. That's what I do in the stock market and in the currency markets every day. Now, this to me is very remarkable because you've got a guy who's a champion of a purported champion of the free society, a refugee from Nazism who has this dark chapter in his own past. Now, look, I'm not blaming him for what he did when he was 15 years old, obviously, but what I am doing is evaluating his adult assessment of that situation.
That's exactly right.
That's the relevant factor here, in which he feels no sense of complicity, no sense of guilt. Now, I remember, my mind flashes in these things historically, and I remember when Joseph Mengele, the infamous Nazi doctor of Auschwitz, who escaped after the war and went to South America. He was shielded by neo-Nazis there, and his son, many years later, found out that his father was alive and went down to see him and to confront him. And his son, Rolf, says to Mengele, "Dad, how could you do this? How could you do the kind of horrific things that you did?" And Mengele replies very calmly. He replies, "Those bad things were going to happen anyway. I didn't create Auschwitz. I didn't create the death camps. I merely came in as a scientist and I saw an opportunity. I took advantage of it." Now, I ask you, is there not a close analogy between this Mengele defense and what Soros is saying is as a kind of apologia for his own actions?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. But you don't even have to take it to Mengele. In other words, the very idea, it's like somebody says, listen, kids are doing drugs. That's not going to change. And if I can make some money off of it, let me get into the thing. And I can use the money to do good things. The point is that in life, you have to take a stand against what is wrong. And you have to say, when I have the attitude that these things are going to happen anyway, I'm already complicit. In other words, when something evil is happening, you have a choice to say, this is evil, and I'll do anything I can to work against it. Or you can say, rather nihilistically, look, who cares? Bad things happen. I don't want to go against the grain. I want to go along for a ride, and I can get off when I want to get off, but I'm going to go for a ride. That reveals a worldview which is very, very dark. It's opportunistic. It's ugly. We may all do these things at this time, but we have to be clear that when you have that worldview, Soros is a multi-billionaire whose opportunism and whose wealth and whose power is being used to do terrible evil today. And so it's important that we understand where he's coming from.
The other question I ask myself is, how does a guy like Soros get a moral immunity pass on the left? In other words, if Soros had been a Republican, if he was funding all these Republican causes, and the New York Times found out about this, for example, they would have blown his cover, and this guy would never be able to show his face in public again.
Right.
But because he's on the left, because he's seen as anti-fascist. You see, this is why groups like Antifa are founded, because they're able to claim the moral reputation of anti-fascism, even as they go around terrorizing people and burning things and shutting speakers down and doing stuff that the Nazis did. They're able to say, look, we're fighting Nazism. That's the big lie.
I think we're at a tipping point in American culture that the election of Trump has allowed us to deal with some things. I think they're being dealt with now. I think even you're writing this book, The Big Lie. We're beginning to think about these things. I think your average American has seen the problems and it has taken note, is observing what's going on right now. And I think I really do believe that the New York Times and other formerly journalistic organs have lost credibility that they cannot regain.
Yeah, because I think people have. The problem isn't just what they say, fake news. The problem is that these are people who are not really journalists, but they're wearing a journalist badge. Look, we put out a movie last year, Hillary's America. We threw it right into the middle of the election. It was a movie that in 1,000 theaters. It was the only political movie about the election. Couldn't be more relevant. In the whole election season, the movie never mentioned once on CBS, ABC, NBC, PBS, NPR. They just pretend it doesn't exist. Now, what kind of news is this? I mean, where do you get to say this is not news because I don't want it to be news, and therefore by refusing to acknowledge it, in a sense, it doesn't publicly exist?
Well, again, what they've tried to do is try to crush the opposition, people who are ideologically opposed to them. And I think most Americans, even if they're not self-identifying as conservatives or evangelicals or whatever, they see this. They've observed this. When we found out that NBC held back this Billy Bush tape of Trump saying this thing in 2005 because they wanted it to be an October surprise to ruin him. You say, wait a second, NBC should be out of business for meddling in American election. We talk about Russia. This is NBC. CNN gave questions to Donna Brazile. This is something that every American knows is scandalous and horrific. The media might not talk about it, but I think people are beginning to see things have changed. We're going to be right back talking to Dinesh D'Souza. The new book is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Stick around.
Love lost such a cause.
We're in a conversation with Dinesh D'Souza. The book is The Big Lie, with the preposterous title, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Except, here's the problem. It's real. Dinesh, it's so funny. Everybody is a victim of political correctness and the pressure. And I remember, especially when I first got out of Yale, when people would say things like this, I would roll my eyes. I think, oh, that's just so typical, silly. And as the years have passed more and more and more, I've thought, well, all this stuff is only preposterous because people say it's preposterous, because the fact is it's true. And we have had a media that has been complicit in keeping these ideas away from us. We forget that all of these heroes, whether it's Steinbeck or Lillian Hellman is the classic example, all of these people, they were in bed with Stalin. There's a really ugly history that we don't hear about. But the ugliest part of it is what you talk about in your book, is that it's one thing to talk about Lillian Hellman or a lot of these Hollywood folks and the Soviet Union, but we're talking about Hitler and the Nazis. That has been really pushed away so that no one ever talks about it until you are talking about it now in your book.
Yeah, the philosopher Leo Strauss once used the phrase reductio ad Hitlerum. And what he meant by this is that people tend to, in rhetorical argument, bring everything down to Hitler. So, for example, you like strawberry ice cream, Hitler likes strawberry ice cream, therefore you're like Hitler.
Right.
I know in California, where I've spent the last several years, people will talk about things like being a health Nazi or a surf Nazi. Now, I think what they mean by that is they're identifying Nazism with like commitment. They're serious about surfing. They're serious about their health. So this is how a term can sort of lose its meaning. Right. Now, on the other side of it, Nazism is used as a kind of scare label to basically put someone out of bounds. Yeah. When I use the term and discuss it in this book, I don't do it that way. I'm not trying to use the sort of scare phrase of Nazi to make people be scared of the Democrats. I'm trying to do a kind of searching look at what Nazism and fascism meant, why people were attracted to those things in the first place. What did they promise to do? What was the problem that they tried to confront? And once we understand that, then we can begin to see parallels and relationships that are often submerged. And we can also look to see what is the relevance of those ideas now. I mean, we're in the 21st century. Nazism was killed off in the middle of the last century. So why does it matter now? Well, it does matter now. I would argue that we are, strangely enough, in a little bit of a fascist moment in American politics right now, except the fascist label is being applied in the wrong place.
Well, again, this is the horrible irony, is that the people who call themselves anti-fascist, the Antifa movement, they claim to be against fascism. And what are they doing? Smashing windows, destroying property, shutting down free speech. The irony is so thick. But the media has been just grievously complicit in forwarding this narrative. And I think it's changing slowly thanks to folks like you, and I hope thanks to programs like this, just to say to people, listen, you know you're not getting the full story. The mainstream media is losing credibility because they have refused to give you these other pieces of the puzzle.
Now, let's give the other side its due, and let me impersonate an Antifa guy who would say, well, Eric, the reason I'm in such a frenzy is because America has, whether wittingly or not, elected a guy who is an authoritarian, a militarist, a racist, a xenophobe. We have Hitler in the White House, or at least young Hitler. And so we've got to kind of go crazy on this guy because we can't allow him to be normalized, right? Now, I think in fairness, and I begin the book, my first couple of chapters, takes this on in a very searching way. So I say, for example, all right, is Trump actually an authoritarian? When I look around, I see Trump mercilessly thrashed by every comedian, every op-ed writer on thousands of platforms. Now, a genuine authoritarian would not permit this. Hugo Chavez wouldn't permit it in Venezuela. Certainly, Hitler and Mussolini would have put it to bed in 5 minutes. They would invade the offices of these people. They would arrest them. They would shoot them. And so, now Meryl Streep, to give her due, said, Trump, hammered me on Twitter. Right? So real brown shirts don't hammer you on Twitter. They hammer you with truncheons. Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is that if this was truly an authoritarian regime, we wouldn't be having all these people bashing Trump everywhere. So the charge of authoritarianism as applied to Trump is at the very best very loose.
Well, it's funny because, again, we're living at a time of such prosperity and such freedom that we've ceased to appreciate it. So when we use these terms lightly, my mother and father grew up in Europe, in Greece and Germany, respectively, during times of genuine oppression. My father saw horrors with his own young eyes. My mother experienced hunger, tremendous hunger. Privations. These are things that Americans are so unfamiliar with, thank God, that we now say something is fascist when it's merely inconvenient. That's again part of the problem. So in your book, you're dealing with this. Folks, I'm talking to Dinesh D'Souza. The book is titled The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Dinesh, again, I'm just so grateful for you, for your willingness to take on what are really tough issues in this day and age. The least I can do is give you a little help here by letting you get your message out. But folks, please buy this book and familiarize yourself with it. We'll be right back. It's the Eric Metaxas Show.
Hear the voices singing soft and low. Hallelujah. I'm ready. I'm ready. Hallelujah.
Eric Metaxas Show, talking to Dinesh D'Souza. The new book is The Big Lie. Dinesh, what can we do about this? This is it's a troubling thing. The first thing I would say is buy your book, familiarize yourself with this stuff. But generally speaking, what can we do?
Well, I think that American politics, what we need now is, my last chapter is called denazification. Now, denazification, the term in the 1940s, meant after the war, going into Nazi Germany, former Nazi Germany, now in ashes, and figuring out how to rebuild it in a way in which the Nazi virus has been, you may say, exorcised. And part of this involved, re-education programs, obviously reforming Germany now as a genuinely parliamentary democracy. And so this was denazification. But part of it was rooting out the Nazis who had become consolidated in the institutions of the culture.
Well, the thing is that we don't have the power of a victorious nation over a defeated nation. I mean, today, when we think what we can do. I mean, the
Oh,
first
no,
thing,
no, of course not.
Right.
That's what I meant. I
No,
meant that we're
right.
dealing with a fascist streak that is in our society.
Yeah.
It's not abroad. We're obviously not going to invade Nazi Germany in that way. So we need a different kind of response. Now, here I take my cues not so much from World War II, but I take them from Abraham Lincoln, because think about it. Abraham Lincoln in 1860 confronted what? A Democratic Party that lost a free election and refused to accept the outcome. Basically, the Democrats said, we're just not going to live with it. Now, the Democrats then chose secession. They basically said, we don't disagree that Lincoln's lawfully elected. We just don't want to be part of this team anymore. We're going home.
By the way, this is to me very interesting because I think we're in a way experiencing something like a civil war in this country. The difference is it's not along geographical lines. Because it's not along geographical lines, the left can't really do what I think they would do. In other words, if we were talking about a handful of states that formed a contiguous bloc, I think that they would try to secede.
And as you know, there's been talk in California about secession, but you're right, it's been somewhat muted. What the left is attempting now is something different. It's you may say, usurpation. They're basically saying, all right, you won, but we're going to figure out a way to get you out of there so we can take over again. And we're doing it by claiming that you've elected a guy who's out of bounds, that democracy has its limits, no fascism can apply, so to speak. And so I think we need to, try to restore to American politics, if you will, the rules of the game. Even the people who say things like Hillary won the popular vote. I mean, think about what they're really saying. There's an agreed upon rules of the game that goes back 200 years. It's kind of like saying, in tennis, you beat me 3-2, but if you add up all our points, I got more, so I deserve the Wimbledon trophy.
Or it's what I often say is like somebody in baseball saying, our team got 20 hits and you got 5 hits, but you got more runs, but we got more hits. And you think, well, that's very nice, but the game is won or lost not based on how many hits you got. It's based on how many runs you got. And the idea that people would bring this up as though it meant anything, it's very telling.
It's very telling. Long term, I think that as conservatives, it's a mistake to think that we can fight only in the political arena. The political arena is one corner of the battlefield. There's a larger cultural battlefield. There's a larger moral arena and a spiritual arena. I think underlying these conflicts are deep spiritual issues. And so I like to see we need a kind of restoration of awareness in all these areas.
Well, it's funny because I often, when I'm talking about one of my books, people say, what can I do? And I say, I'm sorry to say it, but as the author, buy my book and read my book, because the first thing you must do is familiarize yourself with what's happening. It's not about just taking action. The first action is to re-educate yourself and then everyone around you and say, listen, these are things that we've forgotten. These are things that we never heard. If we do not familiarize ourselves with the reality, which is it's an idea reality. It's based on ideas. If you don't understand that, you'll never be able to do it. And the larger idea is that because America is an idea, you really cannot be America. You cannot represent American liberty unless you yourself are familiar with the ideas which the founders gave us, with the Constitution. If you don't understand how it all works, you're powerless really to put forward those ideas, to put those ideas into action, and you're powerless to explain what you do in your book, how the enemies of those ideas are working among us.
Yeah, when I write the book, for me, it's an adventure. I mean, I almost feel like here I am. I've dug deep and I've gotten to the basement, and suddenly I realize there's a basement under the basement. Right. I've got to go there now. Right. So it's this sort of feeling of being almost in a kind of free falling elevator. But I feel like once you've gone through it, you know exactly what to do. It fires you up and you're ready to move. And so I want to bring other people to that state of sort of infectious excitement where they feel like, it's almost like an evangelist who has the truth. And if you'll only listen, he's got something really important to tell you. Now, it's important if true, right? This applies to any evangelist. It's important if true. So my book is important if true. And I submit it is true. And you can verify for yourself if it's true.
Well, again, that's the beauty of it. But I do think that most people, it takes courage to buy this book, to read this book, to be seen in public with this book. It takes courage. So my what I say to my listeners is I hope you have courage, because we're living at a time where courage is needed. If you want to allow yourself to be bullied into some kind of slavish submission to these politically correct ideas that are taking us over, which are in fact fascist, you need to have a little bit of courage, and your courage is infectious. And that's why, again, I applaud you for writing this and talking about it, because it takes a little courage to inspire other courage.
Courage that is shown at the outset will prevent the need for much greater courage later.
That's very well put. Did you say that? Is this your quote, or is this a Churchill quote?
I'm actually paraphrasing myself.
He's paraphrasing himself. That means that's your quote. Well, that's I've heard that said in a number of ways. The opposite of that is what Chuck Colson called the spiral of silence. In other words, when you don't have courage, you make it harder and harder for others to have courage. When you do have courage, you make it easier for others to have courage. So everybody has a voice. You're affecting others. Folks, I'll be right back with Dinesh D'Souza. The new book is The Big Lie. Get a copy, please. Hey folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. A few more minutes with Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh, in this book, one of the things you say, with which I am well familiar, it has to do with the eugenics movement and how the American eugenics movement, led by people like Margaret Sanger, really helped the Nazis form their T4 euthanasia program, and then ultimately form their genocidal plan to wipe out world Jewry. Now, again, here we are. We're living at a time where somebody like Hillary Clinton just won the Margaret Sanger Award last year. People like Cecile Richards, the head of Planned Parenthood, celebrate Margaret Sanger. That right there, you have a tremendous disconnect. I mean, it's like giving the Hitler Award to somebody, but everybody says, well, ignore the bad stuff he did. He did some good stuff.
Well, part of what they've done, Planned Parenthood, if you look at their brochures, for example, they won't talk about eugenics. They will never quote Margaret Sanger saying, more children from the fit, less children from the unfit. That is the primary aim of birth control. That was her manifesto. But that has all been sort of whitewashed. So now Margaret Sanger has reemerged as sort of a champion of choice. So it's a sanitized Margaret Sanger. Now, the real Margaret Sanger wasn't like that at all. And the real Margaret Sanger was a believer in that there are certain, not necessarily racial, but there are people who are superior. They are, in her words, fit. And then there are the unfit. And we should try to get rid of the unfit. Right. Ideally, to prevent them from being born in the first place, right. Hence birth control. But let's say that they are born, figure out what to do with them, and then she goes, forcibly sterilize them, put them onto segregated farms. She had all kinds of very harsh things to say about these people, all of which have been carefully sanitized. So part of what I see my work as sort of restoration, bringing some of these truths to light. They're kind of ugly truths, but they're not ugly when you face them. You sort of digest them, you apply them, and then history becomes useful to you. Otherwise, you're operating in the kind of fog of history, making assertions that make no sense, accusing people of things you don't even know what they mean, and that's the modern left.
Well, all of your books really are an education. I want to encourage people to read them. The one you did most recently about Hillary, you're dealing in facts, you're dealing in actual history, and it may be inconvenient for people, but the fact is that these are facts. In this book, you're dealing with facts that are in front of us. They're everywhere right now. And my question is, are you planning to do some kind of a movie? Because you've done movies of your previous books. They've been terrific.
I would like to, and I'll tell you why. Because it's one thing to learn about something, sort of absorb it intellectually. It's another thing to experience it emotionally. A movie is more of a narrative. It's not an argument. It's a story. It's a journey. And I find that people, for example, who've seen the movie Hillary's America have, in a sense, not only understood, but they have experienced what it must have been like to be under the slave's lash, or to be terrorized at night by a riding Ku Klux Klansman. So the movies to me are dramatizations of the facts, accurate ones.
Right.
And so I'm thinking about doing a movie for next year for the midterm election, incorporating some of the themes of this book.
Oh, terrific. Well, Dinesh, it's just always a joy to have you on. I assume this book will be a bestseller, and people will be able to find it everywhere. But I'm just grateful for your existence in American public life. Thank you for being on this program.
Always a pleasure, Eric.
Folks, that is the program. Thank you for listening. Send these podcasts to your friends. If you go to metaxastalk.com, all the information